Do you remember Hurricane Sandy in 2012? I sure do. I remember being at home with my parents, hearing the cracking thud of a big oak tree branch breaking through their roof. The wind, the rain, the damage. Sandy flooded homes like mine, but also businesses and boardwalks, inflicting more than $30 billion in damages across my home state, New Jersey.
This morning, New Jersey's Seaside Heights, a city synonymous with summer fun, is now a city completely submerged.
In Hoboken, residents are trapped in their homes and waiting for rescue. The water has no place to go.
Sandy tossed boats around here like toys.
Nearly a decade later, Hurricane Ida brought record-breaking rainfall, and once again, my state was underwater. I remember watching the streets I grew up nearby turn into rivers, and my family scooping water from the basement as neighbors checked in. These storms aren't just coastal anymore. They're hitting more inland towns like mine, 20 miles in, bringing flash floods that overwhelm streets and small businesses.
This popular watering hole in Scotch Plains, New Jersey, literally turned into a watering hole Monday night as the flood pushed its way past the locked doors.
We used a bunch of towels and napkins, and we tried to keep the water from coming in. Every time a car would come by, it would push the water into the front door.
At the storm's peak, one cook went home to check on his family, except water started creeping into his van and he needed to be rescued by boat.
For every flood-damaged road, every destroyed business, every home rebuilt again and again, the economic damage adds up. And the question isn't if we'll pay for it, but how. That's what the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection set out to answer in its new report, Economic Risks of Climate Change in New Jersey. The report finds that New Jersey's economy faces systemic risk, from infrastructure and housing to tourism and agriculture, and that smart, proactive investments could reduce long-term costs for communities. This is Empathy Affect, the Forest Marsh Media podcast that explores the human side of government. I'm Melissa Sosinski, and today we'll unpack this report with one of its co-authors, NJDEP Chief Economist Michael Russell. We'll dig into what these findings mean for New Jersey's economy, for our communities, and for the resilience of the state so many of us call home. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to talking with you about this new report and how New Jersey is thinking about economic risk, resilience, and the future of its communities.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so many people don't or may not immediately think of economics and environmental protection as overlapping fields. So it'd be great to just first start to pick your brain on what drew you to this intersection, looking at how environmental decisions affect economic outcomes, and how does that perspective shape the work you do at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection?
Sure, yeah. I think maybe I don't know. I don't want to say how many years ago, but a while back when I was first in college, there was a professor I really liked that was running an environmental econ course. It was not something that I really had a lot of familiarity with, but he had co-taught the course with an environmental science professor, and they really tried to make the case that the economy directly impacts our natural systems, the environment, and vice versa. And I think that perspective really carried through. I ended up going to grad school to study that, and I've continued to work in that area since. I think it's important to understand that within economics, we maybe sometimes think of natural systems just as inputs, as, we're going to take lumber or we're going to take fish out of the ocean, right? And that provides gross domestic product. But environmental change, always ends up in somebody's budget. And I think that using an economic perspective to look at that environmental change and what those impacts might be is a helpful tool for thinking about how we're going to adapt to that change in the future.
Absolutely. So we're here today to talk about this new report released by your department. So it'd be great to get the ground set and learn what prompted DEP to develop this report, and what were you hoping to uncover about New Jersey's economic risks and vulnerabilities?
I think first and foremost, we wanted to raise awareness of that connection between the changing climate and the potential economic risks that can come from that. There's a gap between what we scientifically know about climate change and what we expect to happen. In 2020, we released a climate science report that detailed a lot of those physical impacts. There's I believe a new version should be coming out any day now with some updated findings. But what that means for households and communities and for businesses throughout the state was not as well documented. So we wanted to take those physical risks and translate that into economic realities for people so that they can hopefully think about those risks and consider different ways that we can, reduce our emissions to reduce those future impacts, but also adapt to the impacts that we're going to feel.
Did you want to take a moment to briefly summarize the key findings? What stands out most to you from your perspective as the chief economist?
I think what stands out to me is that climate risk is both systemic, which means that there's a number of potential vicious cycles that can exist within the state. Either at the residential property market, we might see abandoned homes or damage, and that reduces property values. Well, those reduced property values then translate to lost revenue for municipalities, right? And that lost revenue for municipalities might lead to reduced services and reduced amenities in those communities, which can also then further reduce property values at the same time as businesses are feeling the impacts, and maybe small businesses are dealing with rising insurance costs and having to go out of business because of those increased expenses, right? So we have this web, the global economy is web, right? Of these interconnected agents, but damage to one portion of that web. If we think about the 2008 crisis, there was a crisis in the subprime mortgage market that spread throughout the global economy, right? And we could see similar potentials for contagion with climate risk. I think the other concern is that climate risk is an emergent risk, that there's new factors that we will have to consider, areas that have not flooded in the past that are likely to flood in the future, and what that does to our statewide economy as well.
Yeah. The report also quantifies the potential financial exposure that New Jersey faces over several decades. So, what kind of costs are we talking about, and which sectors or regions of the state are most at risk?
So I think, New Jersey is a coastal state, and we're a very densely populated state. The coastal areas and our riverine towns are certainly most at risk. Flood risk is probably the number one threat that we face in New Jersey, although heat stress and wildfire are also a concern for us. So those are going to be areas that we would expect to see hardest hit. Exactly, how that translates to, lost revenue or expenses is a little bit unclear, especially for thinking out to, 2100. But I think pretty clear that flood risk and both from precipitation and sea level rise is going to be a major driver of economic concern within New Jersey going forward.
Yeah, definitely resonates there. As a Jersey girl myself, the flooding has been rough around our neck of the woods, and I know that wildfire risks have been on the rise, and air quality and all that.
Yeah.
So I feel you there. Were there any findings from the report that surprised you, either in the scale of the risk or in where those risks are concentrated?
I think one of the surprises, there's a few things that stood out. I think, how widespread the exposure was a little bit of a surprise that even though I just said, coastal exposure is our main risk, it is not just a coastal issue. Inland towns are also increasingly vulnerable to flooding. And smaller municipalities in particular that maybe don't have the ability to diversify their risk, right, are facing some pretty strong risk. I'm saying risk an awful lot, right? Pretty strong risks when property values drop or those insurance costs rise. I think the other thing that we've discovered over the past few years is how seriously bond issuing banks are taking this risk, and that cost of borrowing for our municipalities is likely going to be an issue, particularly for those communities that are not taking adaptation measures seriously and not planning for a changing climate in the future.
As you might be hearing, risk is rising in places you wouldn't expect it, and the economic ripple effects are very real. And when at-risk communities continue to experience repeated flooding or storm damage, those ripples grow. When property values drop in high-risk areas, local tax bases shrink, leaving municipalities strapped to fund the very infrastructure upgrades they need. At the same time, insurance premiums rise, borrowing becomes more expensive, and lenders consider tightening mortgages in these flood zones. All of that creates a feedback loop: higher costs, fewer resources, and less capacity to invest in resilience. Michael says it's not as dramatic as a hurricane making landfall, but it's just as dangerous: a slow-moving financial strain that can quietly erode a town's stability over time.
It's maybe not as exciting as a large event like Hurricane Sandy, but that slow-moving, compounding economic risk, is really what we're trying to warn about with this report. If it's not priced in already, it's going to compound and really impact long-term stability for our communities.
Yeah. Since you were mentioning resilience, the National Institute of Building Science found that for every dollar spent on resilience and preparedness, that saves communities up to $13 in damages and recovery from disasters. So you were advocating for, how municipalities should be thinking about that, but accessing the funding and resources to invest in resilient solutions can be difficult. So beyond state funding or, any grants out there, what financial or market mechanisms can help communities remain economically resilient? Are there bonds or any industry partnerships that come to mind?
Yeah, it's an understandable concern. Stronger codes and resilience standards, they have a high upfront cost. But like you said, that long-term trade-off is usually in favor of resilience and usually has a pretty outsized return on investment, like 13 to 1, and sometimes we see 6 to 1, 10 to 1. So I think it's safe to say that within the levels that we're talking about, every dollar spent on preparedness will likely save several dollars in recovery. There's some movement towards specific resilient bond instruments that would help those communities. We also, within New Jersey, have an infrastructure bank that is able to support, some of this build out. We have dedicated resilience funding to help communities. So there is statewide aid to help with that as well. What I think we will see in the future, it seems like is likely to see in the future, is that bond issuers will tie some resilience component to the terms of the loan in these riskier communities where they simply won't lend the money to, maybe upgrade your high school if you're not taking steps to make sure that high school is going to be protected from flooding. But our goal is, I don't think we need to choose between growth and protection in the long run. If we're smart about, how we build, how we offer incentive for upgrades, the goal is kind of a durable group growth where we're not building today something that's going to be a future liability for that community, say as sea level rise worsens.
Speaking of this combination of growth and resilience, Michael said that DEP hopes to make climate and economic data practical, giving local planners tools and information to update design standards, zoning, and permitting policies for a changing environment. He shared some low-hanging fruit that can make it less daunting for local decision makers.
So some of that low-hanging fruit or those intermediate steps, right, would include updating flood design standards, maybe incorporating our future flood projections into zoning and permitting, and hopefully, streamlining permits for nature-based solutions like living shorelines, those type of activities that we would expect to decrease risk. Again, this report, I think is really just trying to make it clear to municipalities and make it clear to people throughout the state that the things that we've already projected through our climate work will have these economic impacts.
Yeah, I want to play devil's advocate a little here. So,
Sure.
The report makes a really strong case that if New Jersey doesn't manage these risks, the state's economy will contract. But if you do look at some of the local level, we can often hear the opposite concern, that stricter building codes or limits on development can hurt growth or make housing less affordable. So how do you think about balancing these two narratives, protecting that long-term economic stability while also supporting local growth and affordability.
I understand that that is certainly a concern. And within New Jersey, affordable housing in particular is a major issue. In some areas, it would be ideal to not build, new housing, in particular affordable housing, in areas that we expect to flood in 20 years, right? That's not necessarily doing anybody any favors. So I would encourage, communities that are having that concern to look at, their current zoning and look for other areas that are less at risk and think about where else they could develop and if there's other options available, rather than next to a flood zone or in an area that we expect to be inundated with sea level rise in the future. I think that is a fairly easy step that communities can take. There's often land available for development, and it just takes the time and effort to consider those other areas rather than, some of the areas that maybe were not going to be safe in the future. Again, I understand and I sympathize that yes, having a more strict building code will increase the cost of construction, and that could potentially lead to, less development in the future. I think that municipalities that are feeling that strain need to consider the costs of what does that look like in 20, 30, 40 years, where that development or that apartment building that's being built now is facing frequent flooding and people don't want to live there, or the property value there is declining, but you still have to provide services for those homes. You still have to make sure that the power works and that the water works, that emergency services are able to access those communities. I think that longer term perspective can sometimes be difficult when you're facing a current budget crunch, and the idea is to get more ratables as fast as possible. But as public servants, we have to think about not just next year. We have to think about a more long-term perspective. And are we accepting revenue today for increased costs in the future? And if so, is that a wise investment?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm almost thinking of going down the shore and building a sandcastle you're investing so much time and effort into right as the tide is rising. It's going to sweep it away.
Yeah, and we can see, right, if you every day on the news, seemingly, right, there's a new home in the Outer Banks that is falling into the ocean, right? And I think we've been pretty good in New Jersey about not allowing that level of development that close to the shoreline, but were building those homes necessarily a good investment for those communities? Probably not, looking back now, right?
Yeah. Are there any municipalities or businesses, towns that come to mind that are doing this right, that are taking the steps forward to build resilience and to ensure the long-term economic well-being of their communities based on climate risk?
Yeah, I think there's certainly, places within our state that are doing a great job, right? And are taking the necessary steps. Jersey City comes to mind. They've changed some of their building standards and made some adjustments.
A storm surge defense disguised as a park with a boathouse, benches and outdoor seating as barriers to keep the Hudson from drowning the city again.
There's a number of communities along the shore and the barrier islands that they regulated elevation for new construction, not, there wasn't a statewide regulation that they took upon themselves to require new building at a higher elevation where maybe there's parking underneath or there's, storage underneath, but the actual living part of the home is raised, 4 or 5 feet in order to protect that part of the home from flooding. I think that we can see that throughout the state.
When all is said and done, at least 1,000 homes will be elevated, nearly half the town's housing stock. Residents who've already moved into raised houses have more than a new vantage point.
There's communities that have invested in green infrastructure to help prevent flooding.
This park will detain up to 2 million gallons of rainwater to help combat chronic flooding.
There's communities that are looking at heat very seriously and, opening up new cooling centers and thinking about how we can support businesses that maybe will lose revenue as foot traffic declines.
There are cooling centers like this one here at the JFK Rec Center that are open for anyone who needs a place to just come and get some relief from this heat.
We are making steps in a number of places. There's certainly always more that can be done, especially when we're facing a large amount of uncertainty like with climate change. It's probably better to be a little bit more protective, a little bit extra protective, rather than risk it when you're talking about, especially with building, where a home built today ideally is still standing 100 years from now.
While communities across New Jersey are starting to take their own action, DEP's new report further incentivizes the need to adapt and remain resilient. But Michael and his team aren't stopping there. Next, his team plans to dig deeper into how climate risk affects municipal finances, insurance markets, and even residential migration patterns, who might move into New Jersey as other states grow hotter. So clearly there's still so much to uncover, but the message of this report is already resonating beyond the research itself. I asked Michael, beyond the data and the projections, what he hopes policymakers and the public take away about managing risk and investing in resilience.
I really would hope that people in general would understand that or maybe would see that this growth versus resilience is not necessarily a trade-off, right? That resilient growth is a smarter growth that will protect the residents of New Jersey in the future, but also protect the statewide economy, right? That while costly, adaptation will deliver a return on that investment. And that if we ignore the risks of climate change or hope that they maybe won't be that severe, we're really pricing in a lot of risk for future generations. And I guess more broadly speaking, I think going back to how we started, that the economy and the environment in general are not necessarily in opposition, right? That a strong environment supports a strong economy and vice versa. That we don't have to look towards, maybe environmental regulation is necessarily damaging the economy, and we don't have to look towards economic growth damaging the environment.
Yeah, it certainly helps when the data points to it, and it's really great to have this report as a resource to bring the evidence to the table. One last question from one fellow member of the Jersey clan to another.
Sure. Pork
roll or Taylor ham?
So here's the secret. I'm actually, I was born in Southern Illinois. I was born in St. Louis and grew up in Southern Illinois, moved to New Jersey in 5th grade. It's all just fried bologna to me, and I'd rather have bacon or sausage. It's just not for me. If I'm getting a egg sandwich, I'm probably going bacon 9 times out of 10.
Hey, no shame there. Michael, this was such a thoughtful conversation. Thank you for helping us see the real economic story behind resilience and what it all means for New Jersey's future.
Sure, I hope this is helpful.
Talking with Michael, what stood out to me is that resilience isn't just about protecting homes or rebuilding after a storm. It's about safeguarding our economy, our communities, and the sense of stability that ties them together. When we talk about the cost of risk, we're really talking about the cost of waiting. Every dollar we spend on resilience today can save many times that in recovery tomorrow. And as Michael put it, resilience growth isn't a trade-off. It's a smarter way forward. As someone who both grew up in and now lives in Jersey, I know these challenges aren't theoretical. They're showing up in places we live, work, and raise our families. But they also bring opportunities to plan smarter, build stronger, and protect what makes New Jersey home. You could read the Economic Risks of Climate Change in New Jersey report now and see how your own community could be affected by visiting the link in the show notes. And if you don't live in Jersey, you could check out your own state's DEP for resources to help keep you safe and resilient. Thank you for tuning into Empathy Affect and for joining us for our final episode for Season 3. We'll kick off Season 4 next month, and in the meantime, please rate and follow the show wherever you find podcasts, and make sure to share this episode with a friend. We hope to see you next season. Thanks, y'all.
Empathy Effect is a product of Forrest Marsh. You can reach us at forsmarshmedia@forsmarsh.com with any feedback, questions, or inquiries. If you want to know more about today's guest, are interested in participating with Forsmarsh, or becoming part of our community, check out our show notes for more information.